The image is one of a movable tradition, a member of the royal family, a stoic guardsman at his post. It is a tableau played out for centuries, a silent contract between crown and country. But what happens when a future king, in a quiet corridor of Kensington Palace, decides to break that contract? Not with a shout, but with a quiet, firm order for a soldier to stand down and go home. This is not a story about a tantrum or a trivial dispute. It is about a single, deliberate act that peeled back the gilded curtain, exposing a startling truth about the man who would be king, a crumbling pillar of the ancient institution he is destined to lead, and an embarrassment so profound it was silently buried by a palace machinery built on never complain, never explain. The guard was removed. What followed would haunt the halls of the monarchy for years to come. The late autumn air in London carried a crisp, damp chill, the kind that seeped through even the thickest wool coat. Within the red brick confines of Kensington Palace, however, the atmosphere was one of controlled, institutional warmth. In his private office, Prince William, the Prince of Wales, was ending a long day. The room was a reflection of his modern approach, a blend of family photographs, sleek technology, and a few traditional touches that nodded to his birthright. He was tired, the weight of a relentless schedule of engagements, the constant scrutiny, and the ever-present burden of future responsibility sitting heavily on his shoulders. His gaze fell on a document, a routine security briefing, but a single paragraph near the bottom caught his eye. It was a note, almost an afterthought, concerning one of the long-serving members of the household staff. An elderly housemaid, a woman who had served his family for decades, had reported a series of unsettling interactions with a particular soldier from the Royal Guard unit assigned to the palace. Nothing overtly threatening was detailed, but the language described a pattern of looming presence, unnecessarily blocking her path in narrow service corridors, and comments muttered just loud enough to hear. Remarks about her age, her pace, her very right to be in the spaces she maintained. William's brow furrowed. This was not the first whisper. Over the preceding months, in the subdued manner in which such things were always communicated within the royal household, there had been other, similar murmurs. A junior footman had requested a shift change. A member of Catherine's staff had spoken of feeling uncomfortably observed. Each incident, on its own, was minor, dismissible. But, together, they painted a faint, troubling pattern, one that centered on a single individual, Guardsman Alastair Finch. Finch was, by all traditional measures, an exemplary soldier. His service record was impeccable, his bearing erect and unyielding, a perfect statue in a bearskin hat. He came from a long line of military men, his father and grandfather having stood guard for kings and queens before him. To the outside world, and to the palace's senior security apparatus, he was the very ideal of the silent, steadfast sentinel. But within the palace's servant quarters, a different story was told in hushed tones over steaming mugs of tea. Finch, it was said, carried his rigid discipline into his interactions with the household staff with a chilling intensity. He viewed the palace not as a working home, but as a fortress, and the staff, from the lowest scullery maid to the most senior private secretary, as potential interlopers, civilians contaminating a military post. His enforcement of this worldview was subtle, cruel, and perfectly deniable. He never shouted. He never directly disobeyed an order. He simply used his imposing physical presence, his unwavering stare, and the absolute authority his uniform represented within those walls to intimidate and unsettle. He was, as one terrified kitchen porter later confessed, a ghost that breathed. William sat back, the report feeling suddenly heavy in his hands. His mind traveled back to his own childhood, to the countless quiet, kind faces of the palace staff who had been constants of normalcy amidst the chaos of his life. He remembered a particularly gentle chauffeur who would let a young boy pretend to steer the car, and the housekeeper who always had a secret stash of biscuits. These people were not employees. They were the unseen scaffolding that held the whole edifice up. The idea that one of his own guards, a man sworn to protect, was instead terrorizing them in their place of work ignited a cold, slow-burning anger in him. This was a profound breach of trust, not just of palace protocol, but of his personal sense of justice. He decided to act, not through channels but directly. He summoned his most trusted private secretary, and, with a calm that belied his fury, he gave the instruction. Guardsman Finch is to be removed from his post at Kensington Palace, immediately. He is to be returned to his barracks. I want him off the grounds by tonight. The secretary, a man well-versed in the glacial pace of palace procedure, blanched. Removing a guardsman was not like dismissing a clerk. It involved the Ministry of Defense, the commanding officer of the regiment, a labyrinth of ceremonial and military protocol. Sir, he ventured carefully, would it not be prudent to initiate an inquiry? To allow the proper authorities to... William cut him off, his blue eyes steely. The proper authority here is the one whose household is being poisoned. Have it done. The order was unprecedented in its directness. It bypassed the entire chain of command, a royal missile launched straight into the heart of military tradition. That night, a deeply confused and silently seething guardsman Finch was driven away from the palace, his removal a quiet seismic event in the insular world behind the gates. The immediate aftermath of Finch's removal was a vacuum of sound in Kensington Palace, a silence more deafening than any protest. Among the staff, the news spread like a current of electricity through the old wiring. There was no celebration, only a palpable, collective release of breath held for too long. Shoulders, perpetually hunched in certain corridors, seemed to straighten. The muted clicks of servants' shoes on polished floors regained a rhythmic certainty. For them, the prince's act was not an administrative decision. It was a rescue. It was a clear, unequivocal message from the future king. This is my home, and you are under my protection. Loyalty to William and Catherine, always strong, solidified into something fierce and personal. They worked not just for the monarchy, but for him. Yet, beyond the palace walls, in the hallowed halls of the British Army, and within the deeper recesses of the royal household administration, the reaction was one of profound, institutional shock. William had not just moved a piece on a chessboard. He had kicked the table. In the office of the commander of the household division, the air was thick with affronted dignity. A guardsman, a symbol of the nation's steadfastness, had been summarily dismissed by a royal, however, senior, without a hearing, without a formal complaint, without following the sacred military protocol. It was seen as an insult to the uniform, to the regiment, and to the centuries-old compact between the crown and its military. A formal, sharply worded letter of protest was drafted for the palace. Simultaneously, within Clarence House and the labyrinthine offices of the Queen's, and later King Charles's senior courtiers, a different kind of alarm was sounding. This was a public relations nightmare waiting to happen. The firm operated on discretion, on managing crises before they were born. William's direct action was a wild variable, a breach of the unspoken rule. You never create a document, a record, or a visible action that could be leaked. By acting with such decisive, personal force, he had created a story with legs. The old guard fear the headline. Prince and soldier in palace showdown. They mobilized not to support the prince's moral stand, but to contain the fallout. A veil of silence was imposed. No official reason for Finch's transfer was to be given, even within military circles. It was to be recorded as a routine reassignment. But the stone had been dropped in the pond, and the ripples would not be so easily smoothed away. Guardsman Finch, returned to his regiment's base at Purbright, was a man transformed from a model soldier into a simmering cauldron of resentment. He felt publicly shamed, his honor and family's legacy besmirched by what he saw as a pampered prince's whim. He was also shrewd. He began to talk, not in official complaints, but in the Nafi bar, in hushed conversations with sympathetic colleagues. He framed his story not as one of intimidation, but of dedication. He was, he claimed, a strict enforcer of security protocol in a palace grown lax. He spoke of lax attitudes and security compromises he had tried to correct. He painted William as a modernizer who valued comfort over security, who had been manipulated by a complaining staff into removing a loyal defender. This alternative narrative found fertile ground among traditionalists within the army and the palace's old guard, who were already wary of William's more informal, emotionally intelligent approach to monarchy. A subtle, underground schism began to form. The progressive, compassionate future king versus the stalwart, disciplined old ways. The palace, in its frantic effort to smother the story, had instead given it oxygen in the darkest, most dangerous places, the corridors where gossip hardened into factionalism. William, meanwhile, believed the matter concluded. He had addressed a wrong, protected his people, and assumed the system, however, grudgingly, would absorb the action. He was preoccupied with his own work, his family, and the relentless forward march of his royal duties. He was unaware of the subterranean currents of resentment building in Finch's heart and spreading through whispers in the ranks. Several months passed. The palace, believing the incident buried, turned its attention to a looming major event, a high-profile state banquet at Buckingham Palace to honor a visiting Middle Eastern monarch. It was the kind of glittering, immaculately choreographed spectacle the monarchy excelled at, a night of jewels, uniforms, and diplomatic theater. Security, always tight, was at its most stringent. Every guard, every footman, every floral arranger was vetted and revetted. The guest list was a who's who of global power and British society. William and Catherine were to be center stage, key representatives of the new, vibrant face of the royal family. The entire machinery of the palace hummed with focused preparation, a complex ballet where every performer knew their steps. No one thought to check the roster of the additional guardsmen brought in from various regiments to bolster security for the evening. Among them, following a last-minute administrative request to fill a sick comrade's spot, was Guardsman Alastair Finch. His return to the royal environment was not a malicious plot, but a catastrophic administrative oversight, a perfect storm of clerical error, and the assumption that a routinely reassigned soldier posed no special risk. The system, so confident in its own infallibility, had just invited the ghost back into the machine. The night of the banquet arrived. Buckingham Palace blazed with light, its grand state rooms a breathtaking panorama of opulence. William, in ceremonial dress, and Catherine, radiant in a tiara and gown, moved through the rooms with practiced ease, greeting dignitaries, sharing laughs, performing their roles flawlessly. The evening was proceeding as a flawless masterpiece of royal public relations. Meanwhile, Finch stood at his assigned post, a strategic position in a grand, marbled antechamber leading to the main ballroom. He was a statue once more, his eyes fixed ahead, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his helmet. To the flowing river of glittering guests, he was part of the furniture, a picturesque detail of the pageantry. But to the palace staff circulating with trays of champagne and canapes, his presence was an electric shock. A senior footman, passing with a silver tray, did a double-take, his step faltering. A whisper raced through the servant network faster than any official communication could travel. He's here. Finch is back. The climate in the staff corridors, just out of sight, shifted from focused professionalism to jittery dread. The sense of safety William had instilled months earlier evaporated in an instant. The staff felt betrayed, not by William, but by the faceless palace system that had so carelessly allowed their tormentor to return to the scene of his power. They moved through their duties with nervous glances, their professional smiles strained. The flawless ballet now had a dancer moving to a different, terrifying rhythm in its midst. The crisis erupted not with a bang, but with a terrible, silent visibility. As the banquet reached its peak, the guests began to filter from the dining room back towards the grand ballroom for dancing. The antechamber where Finch stood became a choke point, a slow-moving stream of diamonds, metals, and silk. William and Catherine were at the heart of this flow, pausing to speak with an elderly foreign diplomat and his wife. It was then that William saw her. Across the crowded room, he spotted Mrs. Agatha Branson, the now-retired housemaid whose initial, timid complaint had been the catalyst for Finch's removal. She had been invited back as a special honor for her decades of service, a small, frail bird in a simple dress amidst the peacocks. She was trying to navigate the edge of the crowd, looking overwhelmed. And then William saw Finch. He saw the guardsman's head, ever so slightly, turn. He saw his eyes, cold and unblinking, track Mrs. Branson's progress. He saw the faintest, most contemptuous tightening of his lips as the old woman briefly stumbled near his post. It was a look that lasted less than 2 seconds, a micro-expression of pure, unadulterated disdain. But to William, who knew the history, it was a declaration of war. In that moment, the entire abstract notion of institutional failure became horrifically personal. The system had not just failed. It had spit his own failure back into his face and was now terrorizing a vulnerable, honored guest under his own roof at the most public of events. A cold, clear fury settled over William. The affable prince vanished, replaced by a future sovereign whose authority had been directly challenged. He did not shout. He did not cause a scene. He leaned over and murmured a few words to Catherine, whose eyes widened almost imperceptibly before she gave a slight, steadying nod. Then, with a calm that was more terrifying than any outburst, William excused himself from the diplomat and began to move through the crowd. He walked with a direct, purposeful stride, his gaze locked on Finch. The sea of guests instinctively parted for him, the chatter dying down in his wake as they sensed a shift in the atmosphere. He stopped directly in front of the guardsman, breaking every protocol of interaction between a royal and a sentry on duty. The music from the ballroom seemed to grow distant. "Guardsman," William said, his voice low, crystal clear, and carrying an absolute, icy authority. "You will come with me." Now, Finch, trained to obey royal command, was trapped. To disobey was unthinkable. To obey was a humiliation. A faint, shocked murmur rippled through the nearby guests who witnessed it. Without a second glance, William turned and walked toward a nearby door leading to a private staff corridor, trusting his order would be followed. After a paralyzed second, Finch, his face a mask of mortified stone, broke his rigid stance and followed the Prince of Wales off the floor of the banquet, leaving his post abandoned in the middle of the state event. It was an image seared into the memory of every witness. The future king publicly leading a shamed soldier away like a misbehaving schoolboy. The embarrassment was not just Finch's, it was now the monarchy's, playing out in real time before an audience of global elites. William did not take Finch to a security office or summon a senior officer. He led him to a small, plain service room used by housemaids, a space of mops and buckets, far from the gilded world of the banquet. This choice of venue was itself a profound message. When the door closed, William turned to face the soldier. The privacy of the room crackled with tension. William's calm had evaporated, replaced by a raw, blistering anger that was all the more powerful for being contained. "You," he began, his voice trembling with intensity, "were removed from my home for poisoning it with your presence. Your return here tonight is a failure of this institution so profound I can scarcely comprehend it. But look at me and understand this. That failure ends now. You will never stand guard in any royal residence again. You will never again wear that uniform in the presence of my family or the people who work for us. Your career in this role is finished." Finch, his military bearing crumbling under the direct assault, attempted his defense. "Sir, my duty was to security, to the tradition." William cut him off. "Your duty was to protect. You protected nothing but your own capacity for cruelty. You bullied the defenseless in the shadows. You are a disgrace to the uniform you claim to honor." The confrontation was brief, brutal, and utterly definitive. William then summoned the most senior palace security official and the commanding officer present, who had been frantically searching for their missing guardsmen. In the maid's closet, before the horrified eyes of his superiors, William delivered his verdict. There was no room for discussion. Finch was to be escorted from the palace grounds immediately, not as a soldier, but as a person non grata. His reassignment would be permanent and far from any royal detail. The fallout within the palace walls was an earthquake. The public spectacle, a prince removing a guard from a state banquet, was the ultimate nightmare. Courtiers moved into damage control mode, but the damage was radioactive. The story, rich with drama and conflict, was an open secret among hundreds of powerful guests. The palaces never complained, never explained. Doctrine was strained to its breaking point, as off-the-record briefings were given to a select few journalists to frame the incident as a minor security adjustment, a narrative no one who had seen William's face believed. The real, lasting embarrassment, however, was internal. William's actions had exposed a terrifying truth. The left hand of the monarchy did not know what the right was doing. A soldier deemed unfit for one palace could simply reappear at another due to bureaucratic sloppiness. The trust William had in the system was shattered, and he made it clear that his household would henceforth operate with a new, direct oversight. He demanded and received sweeping changes to vetting and assignment protocol for all palace staff, military, and civilian. The old guard, who had seen his initial act as rash, now had to confront the colossal, systemic failure their own inertia had enabled. In the years that followed, the story of Guardsman Finch became a dark, whispered legend within palace circles, a cautionary tale of two collapses: the collapse of one man's misplaced authority and the near collapse of faith in an ancient system. It was never a public scandal, but its impact was deeper for being private. It forged in William a steely resolve to modernize not just the image of the monarchy, but its very bones, to ensure its human foundation was respected and safe. For the staff, the final image was not of Finch's humiliation, but of William, the prince, seeing the truth in a crowded room and walking straight into the heart of the problem to defend one of their own. The embarrassment for the palace was real and profound, a stark revelation of institutional rust. But from that embarrassment emerged a clearer, harder truth about the character of the man who would one day be king. He had shown that his loyalty ran downwards to the people who served, not just upwards to the institution he was born to. And in doing so, he had rewritten, in a quiet but irrevocable way, the ancient contract between the House of Windsor and the house it kept. //